In 1944, dawn breaks cold and thin over the French coastline as distant explosions bloom against the pale sky. At Observation Post 4, German spotters lean into their field glasses, tracking a formation of V-1 flying bombs slicing toward the channel. Moments later, those same missiles detonate mid-air, one after another, long before reaching London. The sky is lit not by British fighters, nor barrage balloons, but by flak shells bursting with uncanny precision around their targets. "This isn't possible," someone mutters, breath fogging in the morning chill. Inside a nearby command bunker, an orderly slams a wrinkled report onto the operations table. Cigarette smoke curls upward as officers crowd around. The figures, hastily typed and stamped, are clear. 82% interception. Silence settles like frost. 8 out of 10 missiles destroyed in a single night. These are men who live by mathematics. They know the V-1's speed, its flight profile, the odds of hitting such a target with conventional flak. German textbooks state plainly, destroying a V-1 mid-air should take thousands of shells. And yet, through their telescopes, they'd watched British guns perform the statistically impossible. At Flak Regiment 155 W headquarters, housed in a requisitioned chateau, telephones ring relentlessly. Dispatch riders arrive breathless. Maps are spread across long wooden tables, pins marking interception points along the channel. Each new report reinforces the same terrifying conclusion: the British have found a way to systematically annihilate the V-1 offensive. Oberst Max Wachtel, commander of the campaign, stands at the head of the room. Normally composed, he drums his fingers against a steel table as figures are read aloud. 17% interception in June. 74 by mid-August. Now 82. "This is mathematics," he finally says, voice low and taut. Officers exchange uneasy glances. No one has an explanation. No new fighter squadrons have appeared. No radical shift in tactics is reported. But the data is irrefutable. The V-1, the weapon meant to terrify London into submission, is being ripped from the skies at unprecedented rates. Unbeknownst to everyone in that room, they are witnessing the impact of one of the most closely guarded technological secrets of the war, a breakthrough so extraordinary that its security rivals the atomic project, a weapon that doesn't fire faster or farther, but thinks differently. On this late summer morning in 1944, the Reich's confidence begins to crack, not through sabotage or betrayal, but through numbers that make no sense, and a technology they cannot yet imagine. Target 480 words, vertical bar tone, cinematic historical documentary. Only 10 weeks before that bewildering morning, German confidence stood at its peak. The V-1 flying bomb, the first operational cruise missile in history, was finally ready for war to the Nazi leadership. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a promise to bring Britain to its knees through fear, fire, and relentless bombardment. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 13, 1944, the first V-1 lifted off from launch ramps hidden in the French countryside. Powered by its distinctive Argus pulse jet engine, the missile shuddered forward before finding its rhythm, leaving behind a mechanical roar, a sound that Londoners would soon call the buzz bomb. Its target, Grove Road in Bow, East London. At 4:25 a.m., the bomb slammed into the city, destroying a railway bridge and nearby homes. 6 civilians died instantly. Dozens were wounded. 200 were left homeless. It was only the beginning. The V-1 was the result of years of German research at Peenemünde, a place that had already produced rockets and jet aircraft far ahead of Allied equivalents. The missile carried 850 kilograms of high explosive, cruised at 640 kilometers per hour, and flew between 600 and 2,700 meters. In theory, it was nearly untouchable. British fighters could catch it only by pushing their engines to the limit. Anti-aircraft gunners faced even worse odds. Hitting a small, fast-moving target with conventional timed fuses was like trying to thread a needle in a storm. German planners had run the numbers, even a 25% success rate, meaning only 1 in 4 V-1s reached London, would deliver more explosive power than the entire Blitz of 1940-41. Each missile cost a fraction of a bomber mission, required no crew, and could be mass-produced. In their eyes, this was modern warfare perfected, cheap, terrifying, and unstoppable. For the German High Command, these early launches were the answer to D-Day. 1 week after Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Hitler sought revenge. The V-1 was to be his long-range fist, striking the heart of London without risking German lives. As the first missiles crossed the Channel, observers imagined panic spreading through the British capital. They envisioned anti-aircraft guns firing blindly into the night, fighter pilots struggling to intercept, and a population living in constant terror. The V-1 campaign was designed to break morale, to prove that even as German armies retreated, the Reichswehr could still project destruction across the sea. In Berlin, the early reports were greeted with satisfaction. At last, a weapon that could shift momentum. No one at Peenemünde or in Hitler's war rooms realized how quickly that confidence would unravel. In the weeks following the first V-1 attacks, German analysts tracked each launch and interception with mathematical precision. The numbers were expected to favor the attacker. After all, every calculation performed at Peenemünde had concluded that stopping a V-1 in mid-flight bordered on the impossible. The missile's speed, 640 kilometers per h, gave defenders barely half a minute to react. Anti-aircraft gunners had to spot the bomb, calculate its altitude and trajectory, set a timed fuse by hand, load, fire, and pray. At best, British defenses might clip a few stragglers. The Luftwaffe's own probability models estimated the chance of a direct flak hit at less than 1 in 10,000 shells. And yet, by the end of June, something strange was happening. Field reports arriving from French observation stations showed British guns performing far better than predicted. The interception rate had climbed from around 10% to nearly 25% within weeks. At first, German intelligence officers dismissed this improvement as a statistical anomaly, a temporary blip caused by weather or reporting errors. But the numbers kept rising. Inside analysis rooms, Luftwaffe officers recalculated every variable: shell velocity, wind shear, trajectory angles, gun placements. None of it explained the trend. In theory, the V-1 was a nightmare target. Its size and speed made it difficult to hit, and its predictable straight-line flight path paradoxically worked against defenders. They had to rely on perfect timing, not maneuver. One tiny error in fuse setting meant the shell would explode harmlessly behind or ahead of the bomb. Fighter pilots, too, faced brutal odds. To intercept a V-1, they needed to exceed its speed and close to within 200 meters, risking being engulfed in the detonation. More than one pilot had been killed chasing the buzzing missiles too aggressively. And yet, interception rates were climbing steadily. By July 1944, German technical officers began noticing an even more alarming pattern. British gunners were claiming kills using far fewer shells than ballistic models allowed. Coastal observers saw V-1s flying steadily toward England, suddenly engulfed in precise bursts of flak, explosions that appeared too distant for a direct hit, yet the bombs fell nonetheless. "This doesn't add up," muttered one engineer, scribbling furiously across his chalkboard. They sipped her not getting lucky. Something such changed. The Reich's faith in mathematics, the bedrock of its confidence, began to fracture. The V-1 had been designed to overwhelm defenses through speed and volume. But the numbers told a different story now. The defenders were adapting, and no one could explain how. While German engineers obsessed over equations, across the Atlantic, a quiet revolution had already begun. Deep inside American laboratories, Physicists and military engineers had been working on a device so advanced that it was classified at the same level as the Manhattan Project. Its official name sounded harmless: VT, Variable Time Fuse. But its real power came from something radically new, a proximity sensor small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. The story began more than a year earlier, in the Pacific Theater. In January 1943, the cruiser U.S. Helena used shells equipped with these new fuses to shoot down a Japanese dive bomber. The shells didn't rely on timing or luck. Instead, tiny radio transmitters inside the fuse emitted signals which bounced off nearby aircraft. When reflected waves indicated the target was close enough, an onboard circuit automatically triggered detonation. For the first time, anti-aircraft guns could turn near misses into kills. German intelligence had, in fact, caught whispers of such research. As far back as 1939, the famous Oslo report mentioned Allied proximity fuse experiments. But German scientists dismissed it as misinformation. They themselves had attempted similar designs, more than 30 in total, but every effort collapsed under the same problems. Miniaturizing vacuum tubes to survive 20,000 g of acceleration when fired, developing batteries that could stay dormant for years and activate instantly, and mass-producing thousands of delicate components under wartime pressure. They concluded the technology was theoretically interesting, but practically impossible. They were wrong. By mid-1944, American industry was producing 40,000 proximity fuses every day. Entire electronics companies had been redirected to the war effort. Crosley, Sylvania, Western Electric. Vacuum tubes originally designed for hearing aids were reinforced and miniaturized. Batteries were engineered to wake from years of dormancy the moment a shell was fired. Each fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and trigger circuit. A tiny brain that could sense a target and decide when to detonate. And unlike German experiments confined to laboratories, the Allies had solved the mass production puzzle. Back in Europe, German officers staring through their field scopes had no idea what they were witnessing. To them, British shells seemed to explode by instinct, detonating at just the right distance. In reality, they were watching invisible radio waves calculate the perfect moment to strike. What Berlin scientists had dismissed as fantasy was now tearing Hitler's vengeance weapons apart in the sky. By late summer, Britain was no longer reacting. It was hunting. The arrival of proximity fuses had triggered a massive, coordinated overhaul of the nation's air defenses. What had begun as scattered gun positions and desperate fighter sorties evolved into a finely tuned machine of radar, artillery, and electronics designed to crush the V-1 offensive before the bombs ever neared London. The first move was geographic. Anti-aircraft units were pulled south from their traditional positions around London and redeployed along the coastline. This new defensive line formed a concentrated gun belt, stretching across the southern counties like an iron wall. The positioning wasn't accidental. By intercepting missiles over the channel or the coast, dud shells would fall harmlessly into the sea, ensuring none of the precious fuses could be recovered by German intelligence. Technology provided the second decisive edge. British gunners now relied on the American SCR 584 radar, a marvel of precision engineering. The system could automatically lock onto a V-1, calculate its flight path, and continuously feed firing solutions to the gun batteries. Gone were the days of frantic manual calculations. Radar directed the guns with machine-like accuracy. When a V-1 crossed the coast, it entered a kill zone. Radar tracked its every move, gun turrets swiveled seamlessly, and shells equipped with VT fuses burst around the target with mathematical inevitability. Near misses became lethal swarms of shrapnel. The effect was devastating. Back on the French coast, German observers were baffled. They saw V-1 cell flying steadily toward England, suddenly enveloped by dense flak patterns, then tumbling earthward even when explosions looked too distant to damage them. kill claims from British gun batteries skyrocketed, while ammunition expenditure dropped sharply. Inside German headquarters, the crisis deepened. Emergency inspections found nothing wrong with the missiles. Test firings over German territory behaved normally. The problem existed only when facing British defenses. Something in England had changed, and no tactical adjustment, higher altitudes, night launches, mass salvos could overcome it. At the height of the campaign, in late August 1944, the trap reached its full potential. V-1s Sauve roared across the channel at night, their engines buzzing like monstrous insects. As they crossed into the British kill zone, radar-guided guns opened fire in perfect unison. Each shell's tiny radio brain scanned the darkness, sensed the incoming bomb, and detonated at the exact lethal distance. Metal fragments tore through V-1 fuselages, and one after another, the missiles disintegrated mid-air. On a single day, 82% of all incoming V-1s were destroyed over the coast, a rate so high that German scientists had previously deemed it physically impossible. Britain had turned its southern shore into a technological ambush, a fusion of radar intelligence, coastal strategy, and invisible electronics. What German planners imagined as unstoppable waves of terror weapons were now being systematically dismantled before they could reach their targets. The hunter had become the hunted. While German officers scrambled for answers, across the Atlantic, the real weapon was already in motion, not a single device, but an entire industrial ecosystem. In America's bustling factories, workers in their thousands filed through wide hangars filled with assembly lines. Radios, once destined for living rooms, were now being stripped for parts. Corporations like Crosley, Sylvania, and Western Electric had transformed overnight from consumer manufacturers into the beating heart of a military electronics empire. Every day, 40,000 proximity fuses rolled off production lines. By the end of the war, over 22 million would be built, an output so staggering that it dwarfed Germany's total production of V-1 missiles. The brilliance of the proximity fuse wasn't just its clever design, but its ability to survive the violence of war. Each unit had to endure being fired from heavy guns, 20,000 g of acceleration, 25,000 rotations per minute, sudden temperature shocks, then instantly switch on and function flawlessly in the air. To meet these demands, American engineers miniaturized vacuum tubes, originally designed for hearing aids, reinforcing them to withstand battlefield punishment. Batteries were engineered to lie dormant for years, then activate the moment a shell left the barrel. Every fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and triggering circuit, all fitted into a casing smaller than a man's hand. And this complexity didn't slow production. Crosley alone produced more than 5 million fuses, nearly a quarter of total output. At Sylvania's plants, 10,000 workers, many of them women, assembled components in shifts that ran around the clock. The result was unprecedented. Precision electronics, manufactured with the speed and volume of bullets. In Germany, by contrast, advanced weapons remained handcrafted marvels, built in limited numbers under harsh wartime constraints. Skilled labor was scarce, resources stretched thin, and forced labor filled the gaps in grim underground factories. The V-1 program itself relied heavily on slave labor, tens of thousands of prisoners forced to work in brutal conditions. Meanwhile, across the ocean, American workers labored voluntarily, often with little idea of what they were building, but united by wages, morale, and a sense of shared purpose. The contrast was absolute. One side struggled to craft perfect weapons in secrecy. The other mass-produced good enough technology at a scale that defied imagination. What made this feat even more extraordinary was the reliability. Each proximity fuse went through rigorous inspection. Random samples were live-fired in test guns. Rejection rates stayed below 2%, a figure that stunned military analysts. By 1944, Entire segments of the U.S. electronics industry had been redirected toward fuse production. Monthly output of fuses surpassed Germany's total wartime production of V-1s. The proximity fuse was no longer just a technological advantage. It was a demonstration of what happens when science, industry, and manpower synchronize perfectly. The battlefield may have been in Europe, but the decisive blows were struck in American factories. Germany's laboratories produced brilliant blueprints. America produced millions of working weapons. This wasn't just a contest of invention, it was a war of systems. And one side had built a machine the other could never match. On the gun lines of southern England, the crews who manned the anti-aircraft batteries didn't fully understand the technology inside their shells. They didn't need to. Orders were clear: fire accurately, conserve ammunition, and account for every single round. Each proximity-fused shell was treated like gold. Strict logs tracked every shot, every dud, every recovery. Naval vessels patrolled the channel to ensure that unexploded rounds didn't fall into German hands. If one did, soldiers were dispatched immediately to secure it before enemy spies could. Secrecy was so strict that most gunners had no idea why their weapons suddenly seemed to perform miracles. They saw only the results: V-1s disintegrating midair, interception rates climbing, and London breathing just a little easier with each passing day. The proximity fuse was considered so vital that Allied commanders refused to use it on ground targets for most of 1944. They feared that if a single intact fuse were recovered by the Germans, the secret would be compromised. This decision had consequences. Artillery units in Europe fought brutal battles without access to the technology, even when it could have saved lives. Commanders accepted these losses to keep the secret safe. Only in December 1944, during the desperate fighting of the Battle of the Bulge, did Allied leaders finally authorize its use on land. The contrast between production efforts on both sides could not have been starker. In American factories, thousands of civilians, many of them women, volunteered for long shifts assembling delicate components. At Sylvania's Ipswich plant, over 5,000 women worked 12-hour days, often unaware of what their labor was truly achieving. Only after the war did they learn they had played a crucial role in saving London. In Germany, meanwhile, the V-1 program leaned heavily on slave labor. Tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners died in underground factories building the very weapons now being shot down. It was a system built on coercion, cruelty, and desperation. By September 1944, Londoners had endured months of V-1 bombardment. The bombs had killed over 6,000 civilians and injured nearly 18,000. The damage was real, but it was a fraction of what the Germans had planned. British anti-aircraft defenses, armed with proximity fuses and guided by radar, had saved the city from devastation on a scale that could have changed the course of the war. General Frederick Pyle later calculated that without the fuse, casualties might have been 4 to 5 times higher. In the end, secrecy had held, sacrifice had paid off, and survival, once thought to depend solely on courage and chance, had come down to a few grams of electronics hidden inside artillery shells, a secret that changed history. On a single day in late August 1944, coastal anti-aircraft batteries destroyed 82% of incoming V-1 flying bombs. For German officers staring at those impossible numbers, it was a day of confusion and disbelief. For historians, it marked something far greater: the moment modern warfare changed forever. Before proximity fuses, destroying a V-1 typically required around 2,500 shells. With the new technology, that number plunged to just 100. The kill rate along the coastal gun belt soared from 17% in June to 82% by the end of August. This was not achieved through luck, heroism, or tactical brilliance alone. It was the direct result of industrialized innovation, applied at scale. When the war ended and captured German scientists were finally shown the American proximity fuse, their reaction was shock bordering on disbelief. They couldn't fathom how tiny vacuum tubes had survived the violence of gunfire. They were stunned that such complex electronics could be mass-produced by the millions. Some estimated that German technology lagged nearly a decade behind what the Allies had quietly achieved. During the war, German intelligence had never recovered a single intact fuse, not one, even when they unknowingly captured stockpiles during the Battle of the Bulge. Their preconceived belief that such devices were impossible blinded them to what they held in their hands. The Allies' triumph over the V-1 was not just won in skies over the Channel. It was forged in laboratories, assembly lines, and strategic planning rooms. The proximity fuse didn't rely on overwhelming firepower. It multiplied the effectiveness of existing weapons, turning every anti-aircraft gun into something far deadlier. As U.S. Navy Secretary James Forrestal later said, the proximity fuse blazed the trail to Japan. Without it, our westward push would have been slower, bloodier, and far more costly. In the years that followed, the proximity fuse laid the groundwork for modern air defense systems, radar altimeters, and precision-guided munitions. But in 1944, its impact was immediate and transformative. It saved London, shattered the V-1 offensive, and proved that industrial capacity could neutralize even the most advanced wonder weapons. For the Germans, the weapon they never understood became a symbol of their strategic blind spot. For the Allies, it was proof that democracy's ability to mobilize science and industry together could overcome tyranny's technological ambition. As the last V-1s tumbled burning from the sky, they were defeated not by what the Germans could see, but by what they couldn't: a hidden network of scientists, workers, machines, and ideas. The day Britain's coastal guns achieved their record interception rate wasn't just a tactical victory. It was the day the future of warfare arrived.